Hello, everybody, and welcome back to your favorite show. Presumptuous, perhaps. Accurate, definitely. So today I thought I would do another Ruining Your Favorite Artist because I want to. We have, if you haven't noticed, changed locations. I moved rooms, and honestly, when I was editing, those crooked records really bothered me the entire time. So we have switched to filming in my bed. Intimate. Before we start, I want to do a shout out to Intron Autul. Intronatul 2031. First hater, thanks for being here. I know you're watching. I want to just say, shout out you. Thanks for being my first hater. I appreciate it. Thanks, Diva. Love you. Okay. So, today we are going to be talking about Picasso. Ooh, I know. I feel like this is kind of low-hanging fruit because he's kind of the classic artist that everyone knows, but all the more reason to ruin your opinion of him. Picasso has been considered one of the most iconic Western artists for a long time. Was within the general art canon. What he was doing with abstraction was considered groundbreaking. We'll talk about why that isn't really true. I understand the general fascination with Picasso. I too love shapes. So we're going to talk about Cubism, Picasso's paintings, and the glaring presence of cultural appropriation that he built his career on. Picasso was born on October 25th in 1881 in the south of Spain. His dad was a professor of art and painted. So Picasso had tons of access to the art world, art materials, and instruction, all of which were things that your average person did not have access to in the 1800s. He started receiving formal training in painting when he was 7 from his dad, and by the time he was 13, everyone was like, oh my god, he's a genius. Ah! He went to Madrid's Royal Academy of San Fernando when he was 16, but he hated it and just stopped going to classes immediately. So then was kicked out. And basically he just kind of kept fucking around in painting. He started going to Paris a lot. He started visiting in early 1900s and then moved there in 1904, which has a huge influence on what we're going to talk about next. A couple other things to hate him for before we get into what we're mainly going to be talking about: his relationships with women. He was a total pervert. He wasn't perverted in a creative way, in the way that Dali was. He was just a predator. There's less fun anecdotes, to be honest with you. All of the women that we know that were credited of being in his life basically just testified that he was super manipulative, super verbally violent, super cruel, objectifying. One of his large declarations around women is there are only two kinds of women: goddesses or doormats. He very much subscribed to the Madonna whore complex that we see a lot throughout history. Basically, there is a complete binary where there are only two ways that you can exist as a woman. You are either this innocent and infantilized kind of holy figure, or you're literal trash and a whore. Having this binary exist really just takes away any sort of agency or individuality from women, because it assumes that they can just be flattened into one tiny little box, and a box that was created by men. He also is someone who his relationship and how he considered someone on what side of that binary flipped so often, right? It's not like you have a secure position as Madonna. You do one little thing, you show one little ankle, cut, you're a whore now. That's what it's like. Can you guys see my pink hair? I have pink hair now. Do we like it? It's just a little bit. So, context for Europe, and it's not good. It never is. In the late 1800s, early 1900s, Europe is having a field day violently colonizing Africa. They are stealing, we're stealing, we're killing, we're doing much worse than both of those things, and we're doing things that I don't think that YouTube would allow me to say on the internet. And what I want to say is fuck you, King Leopold of Belgium. I'm not even going to call you King Leopold. Stupid fucking name. I know that you're dead, but I wish that you weren't so that I could hunt you down. It's on site. King Leopold. I mean Leopold. Stupid fucking name. Anyways, so Europe is like, wow, look at all this money and power. We got to bring back souvenirs. The problem is the souvenirs are like backbones of people's culture and livelihood. When you take art, you're not just taking objects. You're taking pieces of people's humanity. And it's funny because art is seen as this like kind of holy concept within Europe, right? Do you remember when that museum. Yeah. Do you remember in 2019 when Notre Dame burned and everyone acted like it was the literal end of the world because it is culturally iconic thing that's considered so important? Yeah. So we can understand that art is more than just an object when it's in the West and in Europe, but we don't extend that to anywhere outside of Europe or the West. What I'm saying, these are all concepts that we assume and take for granted in the West, but they are just not offered to other cultures, right? So this period brought about a really aggressive, fetishistic obsession with African art. And when I say African art, I literally just mean African art. We don't know where it's from because when it was being violently taken, it wasn't considered important enough to keep records on. So Europe takes all this and puts them in anthropology and art museums in Europe. And this begins this huge craze. And let's be clear that this is such a deeply violent set of actions. Like I said, when you take art, you are not just taking an object. You're taking a piece of someone's humanity. After the West African slave trade is banned and chattel slavery in the way that it existed had been changed, not really went away at all, but had just changed forms. Europe is hungry to find new ways to control, plunder, and humiliate othered cultures, and especially Black people, because colorism has always been such a prevalent force in this world. So one museum that these stolen art objects were placed in is the Trocadero Museum of Ethnology. And this was a museum that Picasso went to. And he ended up going many, many times. But he goes in 1907 for the first time. And he has what he describes as this like epiphany about art and civilization. And this is a quote on this psychological awakening. He says, "A smell of mold and neglect caught me by the throat. I was so depressed I would have chosen to leave immediately. But I forced myself to stay, to examine these masks, all these objects that people had created with a sacred magical purpose, to serve as intermediaries between them and the unknown hostile forces surrounding them, attempting in that way to overcome their fears by giving them color and form. And then I understood what painting really meant. It's not an aesthetic process. It's a form of magic that interposes itself between us and the hostile universe, a means of seizing power by imposing a form on our terrors as well as on our desires. The day I understood that, I had found my path." Now, on the surface, you could be like, okay, so maybe it is very much giving man does acid for the first time and discovers that empathy is a concept. But if you just kind of don't know much about Picasso, you could be like, oh, maybe he's just kind of having a realization that like art is a way for people to connect and a way for people to put fear and these basic human emotions into forms of expression that allow people to share their fears and overcome their fears, and just as a tool to get through life and the hardships of life. But when we look a little more, it gets a little more hypocritical, I fear. Because why is fear the first thing that he's associating when he sees African art? Why is fear his go-to, right? And the answer is primitivism. Huge in Europe at the time, basically fetishizing and demonizing cultures that are considered to be othered, right? And this exists in more specific forms for a lot of places, right? We have Orientalism, which is not specific because anywhere in the East was considered the Orient. But basically, they're just ways and schools of thought of simplifying and flattening colonized peoples in a way to kind of assuage any guilt that Europeans had by being like, oh no, actually we're helping them. And I'm not saying that this logic makes sense. It doesn't. It's disgusting and hateful and horrific. But that was kind of the thought path that a lot of white people in the West and Europe had at the time. And honestly, like, primitivism was aimed at some groups of people that are considered white today. They just weren't considered white at the time because whiteness in itself is a construct that we've just made up to draw lines of power and money and oppression. Picasso going to this museum begins what is known as his African period, which is only 2 years, 1907 to 1909. This is such a short time, 2 years into his career, and during that time, he made a lot of the paintings that he's well known for. So the same month that he visits the Trocadero Museum, he starts working on one of his most famous paintings called Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, which is a very iconic Cubist painting that is of prostitutes in the red light district in Barcelona. It's interesting that sex workers are the first subjects that he attempts to place this quote unquote devolved art style onto, because they were already seen as outsiders to culture, and very much he filed them into the whore/doormat category instead of the goddess category in terms of how he viewed women. The style of this painting is so strikingly different from any of the paintings that he has done before, and it is immediately after he visits this museum. So I think it's a very fair assumption to say that his visit and his budding obsession with African masks completely changed the aesthetic that he chose to use in painting. Okay, so now we're going to take a little bit of a closer look at this painting and some of the masks that he probably saw at the Trocadero Museum when he first visited in 1907. Because I'm talking about this history in a past tense, obviously I'm talking about the history in a past tense, it's fucking history. But because I'm talking about this in a past tense, I now have more access to knowledge and research than they kept at the time. So looking back, I'm able to give a little bit more clarification to the masks that he probably saw at the museum. However, I don't want to understate that this is not enough. And also I want to clarify that at the time, Picasso would have had absolutely no clue of any of this. The first mask that I am showing on the screen that he definitely saw at the Trocadero Museum is a Pende mask from the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Specifically, it's an Mbangu mask. These masks were typically worn in dances, initiation celebrations, festivals, theaters, and overall just used to teach social values. The story is basically that this man was being immoral and therefore was struck by a spiritual source that forced him to deal with injury and illness. So therefore, when one wears this mask, it is shown to be a warning to not just the youth, but to everyone about the consequences that come with moral failings. It's especially ironic that this is one of the masks that was stolen and then looked at by Picasso, because this mask is an exact showing of ways that people in what is now known as the Democratic Republic of Congo showed, practiced, and set laws of morality. Colonizers who were supposedly bringing morality were not smart enough to realize the laws and teachings that laid in the very masks that they stole. We can see this mask is not exactly mirrored, but very closely mirrored in one of the faces in this Picasso painting. Like last video, I'm not going to go into an intense visual analysis. I do think a lot of the visual cues are quite obvious, and I think that you can pretty clearly see the overlaps in not just the lines, but the angles of the nose, the lack of symmetry between the eyes, the connected eyebrows, the short forehead, and the difference in colors. The second mask that we can be pretty sure that Picasso saw, unfortunately, I have a lot less information on it. We know that it is from the Itumbi region of the Congo, but try as I might, I simply cannot find more information of it. Unfortunately, there's a lot of journal articles that I'm just not able to read anymore because I'm not in school, and so the paywall makes it a little bit more difficult for me to find information. But unfortunately, I have scoured what I can of the internet and I just can't find really any history or context of this mask, which is really, really sad. Even through understanding a little bit of the history of the Mbongu mask, we are given so much more context and shown, even more so than before, how evil and just incredibly stupid colonizers were in their cultural understanding. However, we can see very clearly the deep similarities, especially in the elongated face, the almond-shaped eyes, and the angle of the face specifically. As we quickly saw photos of Picasso's past paintings, we know for a fact he did not paint like this. This painting came right after he visited this Trocadero museum. Therefore, I don't think that it is grasping at straws to say that he 100% based this painting on the masks, mainly from what we now know as the Democratic Republic of Congo. And this is really the beginning of Cubism as a concept, right? We think of Cubism as this wholly European white creation that was somehow like white genius coming up with a new way to break down forms and figures, and that's literally not true. It's just artists becoming obsessed with this quote unquote primitive aesthetic, adopting it into their paintings, and then claiming that they came up with it and that it's actually not primitive when they do it. After he makes this painting, he becomes a obsessive collector of African masks. Shocking. And again, we don't know where they're from. I wish I could say where they're from. A lot of them are generally from West Africa, but we don't even know where, which is, again, so disrespectful and demeaning. The fact that this was even an aesthetic period to him is crazy. Styles of art that have been developed over hundreds and thousands of years are not just an aesthetic, right? There is a set of visual rules and practices that go into it, but it's deeper than that. It's culture, it's humanity, it's livelihood, it's connection, it's love. Now, when we think about this period, I think there's a lot of people that justify it as, well, at the time it was huge. And yeah, sure, maybe it wasn't great how we got these art objects, but it was huge for art at the time. And no one then thought it was wrong. And to that I say, the white people didn't think it was wrong, bro. If you asked someone who got their fucking mask stolen, I think that they knew it was wrong. It's so stupid. There are and have always been people that knew it was wrong. It's just not the people you're asking. It's crazy. It's crazy. He's now given credit for this entire Cubist aesthetic. He's seen as a revolutionary artist. He's avant-garde. Blah, 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 blah. A very clear indicator of appropriation is credit. When asked in the 20s about if he was inspired by black art, he said, no.
Huh? What?
Girl, he was not trying to be inspired. He was trying to steal. He wanted credit for it, and he took credit for it. He took all the credit for it. He loved it. He ate it up. Gross. That's gross.
Ew.
That's gross. And a lot of African artists have voiced opposition to this, as they should. One contemporary Ugandan artist, Francis Ngenda, said, "People tell me my work looks like Picasso, but they have it wrong. It is Picasso who looks like me, like Africa," which is, I think, a very brilliant and succinct way to put it. So now this Cubist style, right, is seen as genius. But the question is, if that's the line of logic we're using, why weren't the West Africans who are creating the art that Picasso was influenced by, why weren't they considered geniuses? Which is where we hit a very large psychological divide. And the answer is, again, if we are really just looking at the aesthetic and influence of the aesthetic, if those are the rules we're playing by, West Africans should be considered exponentially more innovative than Picasso was, because they did it first. And yet we try and erase their entire impact and center Picasso in the narrative, which really shows us that this is more about white supremacy than it is about creativity. When a white guy does it, it's advanced and fantastic, but when a black person does it, it's backward and regressed. Okay, hypocrisy. This period of time was a character for him and an exploration that he could try on and off as he pleases, just completely discarding it when it negatively affects him, which is not the case for the people who originated this art. And then after 1909, Picasso just ditched it. He was like, all right, I'm over this. I'm over my African phase. And he continued to use some of the structural concepts and way that shapes were formed. He continued to use some of that, but his whole like African period was literally 2 years. It was a fad. He tried it on and he took it off because he could. And if that's not one of the biggest signs of privilege, then I don't know what is. If Picasso lived today, maybe he would be canceled. Maybe he wouldn't. What I do know, though, is that he's an ass. Not only was he like super sexist and pretty violent, but he built his entire career off of stealing culture, flattening it, decontextualizing it, and then taking credit for all of the creativity that lives within it. The European art canon wants you to think that it exists in a void. The European art canon wants you to think that everything that exists within it came from white genius, and that's not true. That's all I have today. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you learned that you don't like Picasso. And I hope that you share this information and ruin his legacy for one more person. Thanks for watching, y'all. Love you. See you next time. I'm starting to think this might be a different video.